I want to thank Dr. Pierce Burnett and Sky for inspiring us all. It is now my pleasure to welcome Toni Tipton-Martin to the stage. I could spend hours introducing her, but let me try to do this succinctly. Toni is a culinary journalist, an award-winning author, and a community activist. Her books celebrate the professional skills and kitchen wisdom of invisible Black cooks as culinary role models from whom everyone can learn. She is a recipient of 2 James Beard Book Awards, the Julia Child Award, and many other distinctions. Her most recent book, entitled Jubilee, is a compilation of 125 recipes adapted from historical texts and rare African American cookbooks. Her previous book, The Jemima Code, presents more than 150 cookbooks that range from a rare 1827 house servant's manual to modern classics. Both of these books highlight the stories of mostly women role models throughout African American history and their contributions to cuisine, food activism, archaeology, restaurant design, and journalism. Toni, please, I couldn't be happier to have you here. Please come to the stage. So I've been fangirling Toni for a long time, and I had the opportunity to have dinner with her last summer when we were all vaccinated, and it was one of the highlights of my life. I'm kind of going to tear up because it really was. Meeting you was really a highlight. So I want to thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's really exciting for me to be back in this building after a number of years leaving Austin, and this was actually one of the last places I was before I left. So thank you so much for this invitation to be back.
Oh, we're thrilled to have you here. Yes, let's give her a round of applause. So Toni, I mentioned in your intro that you wrote this really, really important book entitled The Jemima Code. And it explores myths about Black and American cooks and makers and food artisans. And I'm wondering if you can talk about the myths that it helps dispels, because from my personal experience, I know that white folks have a lot of misconceptions about the origins of food in the United States. And so what are some of those myths, those misconceptions that you're trying to dispel?
Sure. So if I could just say one really quick thing.
Yeah.
I started this work because of the myths that persisted in the larger society about who African American women had been in history. I couldn't find any examples of women from my community that were knowledgeable, competent, professional. And I layer onto that the complication of being a mom,
Sure.
raising children in Northwest Austin, in the suburbs, where they were the only Black kids in the school. And as we all know, at the beginning of the school year, you start with American history.
Right.
What does that mean? You start talking about colonizing America and Native Americans and African Americans in the slave trade. And it felt so, it was such a downer,
Yeah.
you know, for me to be talking about history and trying to find examples for my kids so that when they went back to class and they heard about people that were enslaved, I didn't want them to just believe or know or think that the only contribution we made was physical labor.
Right.
And that was the only perception that we had. So the whole project, you know, between the pursuit of a story about my grandmother and the women in my community and who they actually were, aligned with my desire for my children to have a broader understanding of who their ancestors had been.
Right.
So with that, I will say that the mythology that exists around African Americans has largely beyond this labor myth, the truth. Actually, that is true. We were the laborers. But what is compatible with that story is the fact that we were competent and proficient laborers. We were not people who were just mindlessly taking instructions and you know, stirring pots and pulling weeds, right, and clipping cotton. There were people that had proficiencies. Today, that information can seem a little, I don't know, like old news, because people are talking about that more and more.
Sure.
But if we remember that when I started this work 20 years ago,
there was
nobody was talking about this.
And it's so important that you're highlighting all these role models so that BIPOC folks know who their ancestors are, that they can look up to them.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that this book is being distributed, am I right, here at Huston-Tillotson to some of the students?
I hope so. That
Okay.
was my request, because one of the things I notice when I speak all around the country is the books are not cheap.
Right.
And it appears that students would like to have this information, but sometimes the financial barrier is too steep.
Right.
And so I'm really grateful to your organization for being willing to partner with me to make sure that students get a copy.
No,
of
and it
this
is
book.
such a wonderful book, and I learned so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was at a university in Southern California a couple years ago before COVID, and there was a student that was clearly waiting around until the end. He just really wanted the book, and I asked the organizers if they would, comp book, and they wouldn't. So I had to go out to the signing table with my credit card to buy the book for this student. So yeah, it's really means a lot to me that this material get into the hands of the next generation.
Absolutely, absolutely. We all need role models that look like us to look up to, and I think that's what you've provided, and this work has been so important. You're right, it just didn't happen yesterday. You've been working on it for 2 decades.
That is true, and the organization of the Jemima Code as a book, it certainly is, as you described, a bibliography of my rare book collection, but it also places those books in social context,
Right.
which is really, really important. I wanted people to understand that these books did not just exist on shelves, right? That people struggled within a system to become published.
Right.
And then once they were published and once I had them all in front of me, what I discovered was the incredible competencies that were revealed by these books. And so what you can see is that the books organize themselves through decades around careers. And so was able to point out to the future, at whatever age we are, even
Right.
those of us that are coming into the industry as a second career,
Sure.
as one woman mentioned to me earlier. What people are able to see is that African Americans were performing at high level in different ways throughout the food industry, not just in service to others.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that competency is part of this is so important, that what we're seeing in American food today was built literally on the backs of Black folks.
Yeah, for sure. In one of the triggers, there's been so many triggers for me over the years, but we took our kids and we were in outside of New Orleans on Plantation River Road, and there was a plantation that had not yet been excavated and turned into a historic site, so it was still open for, like, the public could just touch stuff. There was no velvet rope or
Sure.
anything like that. And one of the things that the docents was showing us was the difference between what happened in the building when the Black people were doing the work and when they weren't. And so there was this wall, for example, where the brickwork and the mortar was very precise and very strong and sturdy. And then this person identified for us, this is the part of the wall where the owners had to mend the wall after people were set
Wow.
free. Okay, I understand that means they didn't have the competencies, and I don't want to, get tripped up over whether they were, living a life of leisure and all of that.
Sure.
The point that I fixate on is the fact that the African Americans had that skill set.
Right.
So if we level the playing field for everybody and just say nobody had any of those skills, then we can level up and see just how much competency this mason had in their ability to put that wall together.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a really powerful story. Thank you.
Yeah, so I was looking for those kinds of stories in the food world, because the food world is my space, right?
Right.
I'm not a
Masonry.
I'm not a
person.
mason. I'm not in masonry.
No, that's great. I want to turn to Jubilee and talk to you a little bit about how Jubilee builds on the Jemima Code.
So as I have been quoted saying often, when I tried to sell this material to New York publishers, to academics, no one was interested in talking about this content. Maybe because there was no evidence of what I theorized. I had this idea that my grandmother and her contemporaries were smarter than we had been told, but I had no evidence of that.
Sure.
And so until I got the books, I didn't know just how much knowledge they contained. But they contained so much information that once I was able to publish with UT Press, we realized there was just too much to put in one book. It was already going to be such a challenge to the established narrative about African Americans in the food industry,
Sure.
that we thought the best thing to do was initially just introduce the fact that they even existed, to prove they were here. I had always wanted this to be a beautiful coffee table book. I did not want it to be a collection of scholarly essays and
Sure.
footnoted, documentation, not because I don't think that that's valuable, but because I knew that there was also an image that we had to overcome, and that was the image of the plantation mammies. So I always wanted this to be a spectacularly beautiful book. And so when UT Press came to me with the idea of publishing the book, their conditions were two things. One, that I not change the title. They were very excited. I don't know if my editor's here, but that I not change the title, and that it be a beautiful coffee table book. And I was just like, oh my God, this is such a blessing.
That's so great.
So we knew that the next book would have to be the recipes. And now what I'm working on is the third part of this project, which is single subject books, so that we can keep taking a deeper dive into who these people were as time goes on with each book. So the first book in the series is Jubilee Cocktails.
I love it. I love that you're this culinary detective, really seeking out all of these.
That's a good word.
Yeah, let's use that. Put it in your bio, because you have to dig very deep into these historical texts.
You do, and that's part of what I have hoped that the next generation takes away from this work. It's so easy to see now the success that I've achieved, and I'm very, very proud of the accomplishments. But with social media and the internet, it can make it all look so easy.
Right.
And we really need to be aware that there is a rigor and a discipline and a lot of cross-referencing and focus that it took in order to get this material to the place where it is.
Can we talk more about that discipline? Because there are students here today who are trying to figure out what they want to do with their lives. And that discipline is so important, I think, and whatever they choose to do, whether it's being a culinary detective or, being a culinary journalist or whatever career they choose in food or agriculture.
Yeah, so there's just so many points I could make on that topic. One is certainly that I don't want people to get lost in this fact that I've been in the industry for over 40 years. Because that does not mean that I had an automatic entree and a privilege to be able to get this published. As I said, I was unable to get this material published. The industry thought that a scholar would be better equipped to deliver this content. So the first part of that, I guess the first part of my formula was that I had to become as educated as I possibly could to stand in the face of that type of scholarship. So what I did as a journalist was, for a while I thought I was going to just go get a PhD, honestly. That's the way I thought I was going to earn my respect in the industry. And the longer that I did the work, more people said to me, don't you remember journalists get Pulitzer Prizes? You don't have to have a PhD. So I came down to here and I got a borrower's card, a courtesy borrower's card at UT, at Perry Castaneda Library. So the first step I would say is to self-advocate. Get your own information first. And I could read a lot of scholarship. I came down here every day when my kids were at school. And I took one index at a time. So I would read all the Southern work, then I would read all of the women's studies, then I would read all of the American history. Like I just went through each category. It took me a couple of years, and I became self-educated about American history. And no matter where I looked, I did not find the content I was looking for that referred to African Americans in food. I mean, I saw a few things, right? And so I've got a massive bibliography of all of the content that I've read over the years. But what I did stumble on was a bibliography of cookbooks at the University of Alabama. So persistence is also important here. Once I discovered the University of Alabama bibliography, I started to find some sense of my own identity within a system. right? And so the first part was that I just had this idea, and lots of students, you know, young people, people that are new to an industry have an idea. The question is, how do you monetize it? How do you validate it? And the way that I did that was to first become educated and then to actually gather my resources, which meant finding allies, partners, support, mentors, somebody that knew more than I did.
Yeah.
Even if they didn't know more about the subject, they knew more about the industry. And so I have a long list of those kinds of things, but that developing of rigor and really just knowing your facts. I think one of the mistakes that's happening now is because social media has made information so easily accessible. We're not always sure who these sources are. And in some ways it's an echo chamber, and we're just repeating the same material that someone else said. And I think in a lane like advocacy, and particularly in African American studies and history, where we're trying to carve out new identities, we want to be really careful. We don't want to leave room for criticism. Like, I'm not saying you have to be perfect. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is stand in your authority. Like, and the only way you can do that is to know what you know, that you know, right? And not try to be something that you're not. That was also really important. I had to come to grips with the fact that I was a journalist. Journalists do great investigative work. So becoming confident in your own space and your own skin is also really important.
That's really important advice, and that also that validation and the persistence to keep moving forward even when you don't have the answers and they seem very, very far away, years away even.
Yeah, and for me, they were years away.
It's hard to imagine you 20 years ago, like doing this as, you know, going through libraries, you know, before these things were very accessible, and really, you know, making this incredible collection.
Yeah, I never intended to be a collector, but once I came here and discovered that I could not actually see the books firsthand, which is important to journalists. We need to be able to be observers in our own right, and I needed first-person evidence. And so the only solution I had left was to purchase the books.
Wow.
And so I was a stay-at-home mom, which means that I had family resources, but I did not have an income of my own. And the idea of telling my husband that I was going to be paying a couple $100s for a book that was disintegrating, you know, right before my very eyes because it was 100 years old, that didn't really appeal to me.
You didn't like it?
How am I going to tell this man? He says, "What did you buy?" And I'm going, like, this pile of shredded paper that's, you know, moldy. But what I did was to support myself, I sold freelance articles for a women's magazine called Heart and Soul. And I wrote about food and nutrition for African American women. And that was something I could do within this time that I had available while my kids were at school, to raise just enough money to buy a book every time one popped up on eBay that I was able to buy. And the first one that I bought was $400.
Oh my gosh.
And I was new to eBay, but my neighbor was really competent in it. And so she came down and she set the clocks. We were like, we're going to time our clocks for eBay. This is a long time ago. You guys nobody even uses eBay anymore. But it was new then, and it was definitely new to me. And she said, you're going to set your time clock, and you're not going to identify that you're interested in it. Just keep stalking and watching this book.
Wow.
But don't tell it. She had this whole system set up.
It's amazing.
It was pretty funny. And she said, don't tell it, don't let them know that you're interested. So we just kept refreshing the page and watching the price go up. So it started as $1. And the reason that I wanted this particular book was back to my point about finding your own lane and your own identity and becoming confident in it. Once I realized that there was a book published in 1936 in Los Angeles by a group called the Negro Culinary Arts Club of Los Angeles, that set off bells and whistles for me, because it made the point just in the title of their group that they were disputing the mythology of the plantation mammy right there in their cookbook. And so I almost would have paid anything, you know, that I could afford for that book. Anyway, so quickly, I did this, got through to the very last minute where they, you finally put in your bid, and it was like up to $300 and something. And so I entered $400, and I closed my eyes, and, pushed send.
Sure.
And it came back and said, you won. And I was so excited, and later I was invited to speak at the University of Michigan about the very first Black book that we know of to be published in 1866 by a free woman of color. And I put the slide up of that picture, of that book, and from the back of the room, the librarian archivist at the University of Michigan screamed out and said, "That was you?" And so to this day, they are advocating to be the place where my book archive goes, because I somehow owe it to them that I took a book from the students. So I keep trying to give back to students everywhere I go.
That's amazing. Thank you. I think one of the things I like about your work the most is that you do keep identifying these alternative pathways to success. It's not just about being a journalist or an advocate. It's about finding all of these other routes to standing in your own place, standing in your own skin. I'm wondering if you can dig a little bit more into that and why that's important and how you've learned to do that throughout the years. It's difficult. I'm still learning. You're still learning, I'm sure.
It's so difficult. And the social narratives that we have all been brought up under, like we were talking about just backstage, this tendency that some of us have to apologize all the time.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to point out that you stepped on my foot. Like those are just the things that we do subconsciously. And so there's all of this that's circulating and swirling around us. But I wanted to make sure that, as I said, students, young people particularly, would understand that there were so many other pathways in this industry. And the one that's freshest of mind to me today is the bartender story and mixologist, because I'm working on a cocktail book. And I am not a bartender. That's not my area of expertise, but I have become educated about that. And what I've discovered is that there was a point in time where African Americans were, well, let me start over. The African American book collection has cocktail recipes in it up through Prohibition. Then they end and they disappear from the pages of the book, and they don't start again until after the soul food era in the 70s. So the first question for me as an investigator is, what's going on here?
Right.
Why do these recipes disappear? Why aren't they being handed down? So I start with a question. What I've discovered is that the social narrative that I think drove that is that African Americans were being portrayed as derelict, lazy, public drunks, wasting their money in juke joints. I stumbled on a series of photographs that have captions that say things like, these sharecroppers wasting all their money in juke joints. And so I am now not trying to put a Pollyannish spin on that story. What I'm looking for is, what do the Black people say about this? What was their experience here? And we all have that ability to step outside of ourselves and ask about someone else's experience.
Absolutely.
We can ask, what can I do? Where can I make a difference? And in my case, it is to look at these stories that have run up here throughout history and look for the counter narrative. What are the African Americans doing? They're not doing anything different than anybody else in this situation. They've worked all week. We all go out, can't wait to run to happy hour, right? Like there's all these things that we do that the rest of society does, and yet the portrayal is somehow negative.
Absolutely.
And so that's going to be what spins this book, is this giving a new legacy to African Americans in the bartending profession, and what that really means. There's been a lot of work already on Black mixology, which is really, people don't even think those two things go together. But there's an entire group of men who in the end of the 19th century they had a group called the Colored Mixologists Club.
I love it.
Yeah, so there's lots of counter narratives that we can tell.
And that's why we're here today, to explore those counter narratives and make sure that we hear truths. that those come out. I could talk to you for hours, as you know. We have sadly run out of time. Let's give Toni Tipton-Martin a round of applause, please.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Please.